Airtable Automations is super powerful. However, it's not always clear where to start. In this video, we're going to go through each Airtable trigger so you always feel confident to know which one to use for your use case. If you're new here, my name is Aaron, and this is Automate All the Things, where I help you work smarter, not harder, using no-code tools like Airtable, Zapier, Webflow, and others. Check out AATT.io for a free course on Airtable and other great resources on getting started with no code. Airtable Automation lets you automate so much work. Lets you send an email when a form is submitted or create work items automatically when a project is approved. However, every automation starts with a trigger, and it's not always clear which one you should use when. Is the right one when a record enters a view, when a record is created, when a record matches conditions? Let's go through each one by one and understand which one is right when, so you always feel comfortable picking the right trigger for your automations. Let's jump in. Okay, so I'm here in my applicant tracker base. This coming from a template that I've modified a little and added some automations. I'll link to it in the description if you want this exact base. So a very simple base where I've already created automations for the different triggers. So we're gonna go one by one through each trigger and understand how they work. So the first one is when record is created. So I have that automation already set up, and what this does is when a record is created in the applicants table, it goes ahead and sends a Slack message to let the team know that there's a new record there. So the reason you would use when record is created is under two different use cases. First, all records in your table are created using a form. So that's use case number one, and I'll show an example in a moment. And use case number two is that you are wanting to trigger automations off of new records in a synced table. So let's go into exploring those two use cases, and then I'll show you a situation where you shouldn't use when record is created. So I've got my applicant form right here. Let me go ahead and open that up. Let's go ahead and submit an application. But first, you need to turn on the automation. Very important, almost forgot that. So let me go ahead and here in the form and submit our application. So let's say I'm applying for the mascot role. Let's say I want the lead mascot. I'm going to drop my email and then my phone number. There you go. Submitting that. And you can hear that Slack message letting us know that we've just submitted a Slack message or received a Slack message because we have a new applicant, Aaron Kornblit, in our table. So this triggered this, and you can see that Slack message right here. Now, what's important is that you shouldn't use when record is created if folks are just creating records, willy-nilly in your table. And an example of that is, let's say someone manually creates a new applicant. Maybe they heard them over the phone, they came in through the door, and they start writing information, right? So let's say their name is John. You can hear that Slack message has been sent before that person had time to fill out the whole record. So if I come here, we have a new applicant, their name is, and we don't have the name. So this is why you do not use when record is created for tables in which records are manually created. Very important to understand. Okay, and the second situation in which you should use when record is created is when you have synced tables. So here I have a synced table of all open positions. All information in this table comes from the positions base. So let's say here I add a new position. So say new mascot, no new mascot for the team, no experience required. So now I'm going to manually sync this. This happens automatically every 5 minutes. And this will create a new record in your table. So that makes it okay to use when record is created for synced tables. Okay, so when record is created, great for when all records in your table are submitted by forms, or if you want to trigger automations off of synced tables. Okay, now that we've covered when record is created, the second trigger we're going to talk about is when record matches conditions. But I'm also going to group in here when record enters view because both of those can be used interchangeably. So when record matches conditions lets you trigger an automation when an existing record meets specific criteria. So in our case, we're saying when an applicant in the applicants table has stage hired, go ahead and create 2 records in an onboarding table. So those are adding that applicant to benefits and then sending them a welcome package. And this is our 2 recurring tasks that always happen when an applicant is hired. So when record matches conditions is extremely useful here because it is an existing record and we only want to trigger that automation when we've hired that specific candidate. So let me turn that on and understand how this automation works. So let's say Rin Shah has been hired. It's going to go ahead and update that information and run this automation. So I can see that it's run successfully just a second ago. And if I go into onboarding, I see those 2 onboarding tasks automatically created in that table. So when record and matching conditions is the right trigger for this specific type of automation. Now, I mentioned that you can use when record matches conditions and when record enters view interchangeably. So let me go ahead and turn off this automation. And then when record enters view, well, in this case, we're saying when a record enters a specific view, go ahead and update or run the automation. This automation does the same thing. It creates those 2 template task items in our onboarding table. But what's important here is that if we go to the hired candidates view, which is where a record needs to end up for this automation to run, well, you notice this filter. And these are the conditions under which a record enters the view. So when you think about it, when record matches conditions and the view filtering are the same. So I'm saying when stage is hired, go ahead and enter this view, and that's going to go ahead and trigger the automation. So in most cases, I do recommend using when record matches conditions as your trigger for existing records that need to meet specific criteria for an automation to run. And the reason is that if you use when record enters view is that anyone can change this information. So let's say this person says, well, you know what? Well, hired candidates now includes candidates that are interviewing. Well, that's going to go ahead and trigger the automation for every single candidate that is interviewing. So one way to kind of fight that, if you will, is to go ahead and lock the view. But in most cases, I do recommend when record matches conditions because then you're assured that no one's going to go ahead and tinker with a view configuration and then set your automation in motion. But just to prove to you that it's the same, let's go ahead and turn on this automation. Let's go back into all applicants. And let's say I've been hired as a lead mascot. That's going to go ahead and move that record right here into our hired candidates. If I go into onboarding, you'll see that those 2 onboarding records are there. So again, when record enters a view and when record matches conditions, same output, but do recommend when record matches conditions. The third trigger I want to talk to you about is when record is updated. So I have an automation here, and this lets you trigger automation when a record is updated. So you can trigger it on updating any information, right? So if any field changes, you can go ahead and send a message or send an email or create records or whatever have you. Or you can be very specific and say only changes in this specific field should trigger this automation. So when record is updated is particularly useful when you want to track the updating of an important field. So in my instance, I'm saying when a record is updated in the applicants table, but only when the stage changes. So I want to be going ahead and tracking or being notified of changes to any candidate's status. So what I do when that happens is going ahead and send a message to say, hey, this applicant is now in this stage. So let's go ahead and turn that on, see how that works. Turn on. Let's say Casey went from interviewing to decision needed. That should go ahead and trigger the automation and send the Slack message. If I go to run history, you can hear that Slack message was just sent. If I go over into Slack, I see status of Casey Park is now decision needed. So Slack runs a little faster than Airtable, and then we see that that's run successfully. So when record is updated, very useful when you want to track any changes, but particularly useful and most used when you want to track the changes in a specific field. So the fifth trigger is a little different, and it's called at scheduled time. So let's say you run an automation at a specified time, say every Monday at 8 a.m. or every weekday or every hour or every 5 hours. And there's one particular use case that is very common for at scheduled time, which is to create a kind of a digest email. So let's say every morning you want to know every action item that is assigned to yourself or to the team. Or in this case, let's say we want to send an email at 9 a.m. every morning to let everyone know who is interviewing, who is in the interviewing stage. So in my automation, I have at a scheduled time. I've said it's at 9 a.m. every weekday. And then to create this digest use case, you pair that trigger with the action of finding records. So here I'm saying go to the applicant table and find every single applicant that is stage in interviewing. So we have 2 right here. And from there, the second action is to go ahead and send an email. In my case, I send an email to myself with subject line interviewing, and then importing right from step 2, find records, render as HTML list. So I'm actually going to go ahead and click in, go to step 2, go to records, and then you have the option of including them as a list or as a grid that just changes the way you see that information in the email. Including that in my email, and then clicking done. So that is the most common use case for at a scheduled time. So some people will also run scripts, for instance, so you can have as an action, run the script every day at 9 a.m. I won't be going into that into this video, but if you want to learn how to write scripts, you can click here, which is a 4-part series on how to write scripts in Airtable. Okay, so let's turn this on, see how it works. It's going to go ahead and turn it on. And actually, because I don't want to wait till 9 a.m., I'm just going to go ahead and test every single step. So testing step 1, it's going to go ahead and find the records that are interviewing. You can see that it went to the applicants table and pulled out 2 records, Casey Park and Joe Moreau. And if I test that email, in my inbox, I'm going to go ahead and find this email from Airtable Automations right here. And then I have those 2 records. So I've inputted the whole record as information, and I have those 2 records. So at a scheduled time has 2 primary use cases. The digest email, number 1, which lets you send information of all records that match specific conditions and can be received by email, Slack, or other places. Or second, to run a script. So the last trigger I haven't touched on is when webhooked is received. So when webhook is received is for every service that Airtable doesn't directly integrate with. So I'm not going to go into the technical of what is a webhook, but essentially imagine it as a phone number that any other service can call. So this creates a URL that you can submit to other services that when something happens in that service, whether that's MailChimp, Webflow, which I'm going to use here, any other service that can generate or send webhooks, you can send information into your Airtable base. So let's do an example here where I've created a way for Webflow form submissions to end up in Airtable. So for whatever reason, if you want to use a Webflow form and not the Airtable native form, you can go ahead and use when webhook is received. So let me turn that on. All that does is when it receives a webhook from Webflow, it creates a record in our Airtable base. And you can see that form is right here. So let's say I'm going to put my name, and I'm going to put aarontest@gmail.com. Submitting that, that's going to go ahead and send the webhook to our Airtable base. You're going to see run history. It's run successfully, and it's created this record right here. So again, if you're interested in webhooks, I'm just going to drop a link right here to a stream where I talk about webhooks more in detail. So with that, webhook, so what you need to know is webhook received is great. when Airtable doesn't natively integrate with the service that you're looking to integrate with. So with that, we went through each trigger. So now you should feel confident that no matter what automation you're building, you know which trigger to choose. Enjoyed this video and now feel confident. I do hope that you'll like the video. To let me know that that's the case, leave me a comment with the first automation you're gonna go ahead and build, and subscribe to get notified when new videos are out that help you work smarter, not harder. So until then, see you later.